Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we keep curiosity alive and dig beneath the surface of what we think we know. You are going to be in for a treat. Today's conversation is powerful. We're joined by Melissa Monte, who's the host of Mind Love, and she's been helping people rewire their minds and hearts for years. Maybe you've tuned into her show, so you know that she brings a rare blend of depth, playfulness, and actual practical spirituality, which is saying something in the world that loves to float above the hard stuff. You know what I mean, guys? So today we're going to explore 3 big ideas. 1, how to read your worst moments, more like sacred curriculum. 2, why the same myths appear in every culture, and the difference between spiritual bypassing and true integration. And I love these topics because they blend psychology, philosophy, consciousness, and meaning, where suffering, storytelling, and then self-awareness all start to overlap. So without any further ado, let's begin the interview. So Melissa, thank you so much for joining me. We just had a powwow prior to pushing record and realized we have so many things in common. And that's really a treat to meet someone like you. And so can you just introduce yourself to the listeners who maybe haven't heard of who you are and your awesome podcast, Mind Love, and then we'll dive into the nitty-gritty of the content today.
Yes, my name is Melissa Monte. I'm host of a podcast, Mind Love. I started it knowing only that I wanted to actually explore a passion of mine instead of working for somebody else. And I did a lot of work to really figure out, like, what is my thing? What is going to bring out the uniqueness of who I am and share my gifts with the world? And so I came to the idea of Mind Love because it's all about the power of the mind. Everything in my life came back to that, whether it was healing, whether it was regaining trust in myself after the winding journey that I took to figure life out, including getting a felony for somebody else's crime, a lot of things that at the time I thought of as mistakes. And I did the work to really figure out that it was really my curriculum, why I was put here, the things I was supposed to get through so that I could share in the way that I share. And so Mind Love has really grown into a business with different programs and coaching and things like that, but it is still the most passionate part of my life besides my kids. And so I'm just grateful to share all of the things that I have evolved into and over and through in the last 20 years.
Yeah, and I'm sure my listeners can relate to evolving out, through, over, under. And did I see that you were pregnant with another baby?
3rd boy, yes.
Yeah, congratulations. I just wanted to say that that's such a blessing, and I'm so happy for you. So let's dive into that because that is what we wanted to cover today. And I can relate to that. Another thing I can relate to about you that we didn't touch on prior to recording is I've called myself, and I don't know if I still relate to this, but I've said it in the past, a wounded warrior. As in, when I stand up from the lesson that life has given me, I want to kind of teach that as a personal trainer, as a lifestyle coach, as a circus performer, as a puppeteer. That's what I've done for the last 20 years. I was always trying to, similar to what you were doing, like what this personal alchemy is trying to take the chaos into sacred medicine. And that's something that I'd love for you to kind of walk through for us. Like, how do we take turning pain into medicine? Because later in the segment, we're going to talk about spiritual bypassing, which I think is something we can easily fall into, whether it's New Age or, religion. But can you just break down what that actually could look like, turning these worst moments and into sacred curriculum?
Yeah, well, the way that I got here wasn't an easy path or a straight line whatsoever. But it was, I took action on the things that I knew at the time. And I think that's the most important thing that anyone could really know to do, because we're all going to take different journeys toward our healing. We all need slightly different things. And it's really difficult to be sitting in your mess and say, well, all I have to do is these steps 1 through 4 right here and I'll be out of it. It just doesn't work that way. No matter how much a coach tries to sell you their golden program, everyone capitalism always wins. And so you just have to realize that like there is no quick fix. There's no magic bullet or anything like that toward your healing. What worked for me was staying open. And when I had inspiration, I followed it. Now, in the beginning, there was a lot more resistance to that inspiration. I didn't yet know that this is how it worked, that this is how life worked, that this is how inspiration or following your own guidance worked. Usually in the beginning, it was me getting to the point where the pain of change was less scary than the pain of staying where I was. So I finally took action. Over time, I realized, hey, the faster I take action, the more I'm guided. And so now I have an idea and I just work toward it. I just take the first step. I might only know the first step. And then maybe that step shows me I need to pivot. There is no going backward. There's no backtracking. There's no making mistakes. It's what you need to see with that step. And so that's how I go about all of my life now. Yes, I have created frameworks that make some things a little less of a kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall. The things that I know worked, the things that have been proven through time, through science, and put them into a stretch. And I'll share with you some of the steps that make it really, really easy to kind of see what your life is guiding you toward. And my 7 steps is the algorithm, knowing what you were taught about, what you were born into a certain thing. And so you can do this with your overall life, or say you're working on one thing, like you keep attracting the same patterns in relationships. So look at through the lens of relationships. What were you taught about love? What were you taught about relationships? What were you taught about being with another person? What were you taught about men or women or roles in relationships? What recurring experiences have shaped your beliefs? This is where you're starting. Understanding this is going to give you a lot of insight into what you need to heal and how you need to heal it. The next step is usually the disruption. What moment made you realize something wasn't what you thought? Maybe it was some big rock bottom moment. Maybe it was just something somebody said that hit you in a new way. Then is the awakening. Sometimes this is right over top of the disruption. Sometimes it takes a few years to really see it, but now you're seeing the pattern for what it was. What was the exact moment, or what assumption did you realize wasn't actually true? What stories from your past made sense in a new way? Then is the resistance. This is the battle between old and new. Quite often we know what to do to fix our lives, like break up with the toxic guy or go to the gym, whatever it is, but it's not always easy to just create a new habit or to let go of something that we've been tied to for so long. People tend to live here for a really long time. But then's the choice. When you finally decide to choose, say, okay, I'm not doing this back and forth anymore. I'm going to buy the gym membership. I'm going to break it off. Then is the embodiment. This is like the becoming the new version of you. What are all of the little steps and actions and habits that you had to solidify to solidify this transformation? And this framework right there, those first 6 steps, isn't something I made up out of thin air. It's actually the hero's journey, but with slightly different prompts to help you see yourself in it. It's what every great story ever told follows in order to find the hero. And so the goal is to make yourself the hero of your own story. But step 7 is what most people miss, that I think is the most important part. If you actually are reflecting back on your life, using your life as a mirror in order to see what you need to work through. And that is the gold. It's the deeper meaning and patterns. Looking back, what was the story really about? How does this experience help you help others? What's the one sentence of wisdom that the journey gave you? What new patterns do you see in your life now? How are you specifically equipped to help other people that went through something like this? And so this is what I now look at all of my new struggles with, even now, where I'm like, well, what is this? Why does this keep showing up? Why does this money issue keep showing up? Why do I keep feeling discontent? Let me just go back through and figure out. And you don't always have to go super deep on all of the steps, but knowing where you're starting, knowing the shifts that you want to make, knowing the wisdom that you've gained from it, those three key parts will help you see any situation in a new light.
Yeah, that was really helpful and concise. And I think it's this phrase I heard growing up, inch by inch, life can be a cinch. And so much from there's a craving for certainty. And so when we're struggling with chaos or we're stuck in the stinking thinking, it can be really difficult to fall back into maybe a dogmatic thinking or dogmatic ideology because of that temptation of wanting certainty instead of, and that's kind of what the inch by inch concept can kind of provide, the certainty of just doing this one step at a time instead of trying to have it all figured out. The framework can help almost as well because the brain just craves coherence, I've learned, and dopamine that comes with the control of that. And that's why cognitive dissonance is so prominent. You like get a hit when you're like convincing yourself of, you're like gaslighting yourself, whatever you're doing. And so that's fascinating. And so the framework is really helpful. The hero's journey is, even seen in some of the biblical texts in some ways. So it is definitely a very popular motif that we see. And so do you think the antidote to learning is to find meaning instead of the controls? Basically, the breakdown of what you were just saying is trying to find meaning and glimpse of wisdoms instead of trying to seek control.
Well, there's a couple things. You mentioned how we crave coherence, and that is true on so many more levels than I think most people realize. For example, Dan McAdams at Northwestern University spent decades researching something called narrative identities. And he found that people with coherent life narratives have better outcomes, whether it's higher levels of mental health, well-being, resilience. And what does a coherent life narrative mean? And if you think about that, so often we're seeking control about something in the future, but where our distress actually is coming from is the fact that we have all of these inconsistencies in the way that we see ourselves. We are on a spiritual path to be a good person, but we have these things that we can't quite get over, where we're looking at ourselves as potentially a bad person. And so one of the ways to work with your own story, and the reason I like that framework, is because it helps you to see and reframe things in your life. Now, when it comes to finding meaning, we are meaning-making machines. We are finding meaning whether we're doing it consciously or not. One thing I'm always teaching is we only really have two choices: either create our lives consciously or unconsciously repeat. And what people get into, especially when they first get into New Age or the law of attraction, is they're like, oh my God, I can manifest. I think I'm going to manifest today. And then the rest of the week, I'll wing it. And it's like, that's not how it works. That's not what manifestation is. It's not sitting down and suddenly dreaming up $1 million. It's realizing that your thoughts and your beliefs are creating what's possible for you. It's shaping what opportunities you even see in your life. That's why two people can be faced with the exact same opportunity and one sees it and one doesn't. They're automatically rejecting it based on what they believe is possible for themselves. And so going back to this idea of creating meaning, what I find even more important than creating the meaning that we're giving something is first bringing awareness to the meaning that we're giving something, because we're doing that anyways. What meaning did you just give that argument? What meaning did you give that mess up you made when you were 22? What meaning did you give the time you stole a lipstick from Walmart? Like, what meaning are you creating about yourself, about possibilities in the world, about other people through your life experiences? If you start to bring that to the surface, a whole world will unlock first of all, because you get out of victim consciousness. You start to realize that some of these things were subjective and you were painting them your own color. And so if you can step back and create that space, then you realize, wait, I can change the meaning. I can be more conscious about the meaning that I want to give this moment. And so, yes, it's about creating meaning, but there's a few more steps before that as well.
Oh, yeah. That really hit a lot for me in regards to maybe some of the examples you mentioned, but that is not only reframing chaos and trying to find some sort of meaning, but then the deeper layer is how you've already identified yourself and all the past mistakes or choices you've made. Because I definitely stole when I was little, and I have I don't really get too personal because I end up always deleting it anyways before it airs. And so there's no reason to throw it all out there. But it is fascinating. I really appreciate that because there's a lot of that work in even cognitive behavioral therapy or in the parts work that you can do in the IFS systems and trauma work is kind of understanding what you've attached or to those situations and how you can rewrite that into and it's again it's we're going to talk more about this. Isn't about bypassing it. It is trying to get that bird's eye view or try to be a little bit more objective, which is really difficult to do, I think. And so the idea we're talking about is really the pain can be a teacher, right? And this shows up everywhere from ancient myth, which is what we're going to dive into next, to modern therapy, which I just mentioned some techniques. But this isn't a shortcut. That's the thing that I'm really picking up on, is that this is powerful, but it isn't a spiritual shortcut by any means. There's integration, which I know is a big part of the work you do. And that's kind of that seventh step you mentioned as well. It's not just like some inspirational quote. When you talk about embodiment, that is really a difficult thing to follow through with day in and day out. You can even have gotten the gym membership, but then maybe you had an old injury flare up and now you're back out of the routine and still paying the monthly membership. And who could that be? Me. But I'm really close to going back. I'm like so close to being strong enough to really needing some of the equipment there. So the next segment was going to be something I'm so pumped to pick your brain on: the why same myths can appear in every culture. And so you say that consciousness leaves identical fingerprints wherever it evolves. Maybe those aren't your exact words. Maybe I'm paraphrasing. But I think that's really fascinating way to put it. So could you unpack more about that for me?
Yeah. So this was actually a big part of my deconstruction journey. And I actually started in college. I'd already been falling away from my religion. And then I went to college. And mind you, I had gone through a number of traumas during this time. I was sexually assaulted twice. My dad died. A very close friend died by suicide. And then I went to college and I was just bypassing it all. I knew very little about self-development, but I had a couple things that stuck, like mind over matter, for example. And so I was like, well, I'm just not going to let this affect me. And my heart was in the right place. But what I didn't know was that trauma gets stored in your body. And so if there's no release, it's going to manifest in ways that I have no control over, no say over. I ended up becoming severely bulimic at very low self-worth, all sorts of things. I go into a world religions course and I'm starting to learn about how these different stories had appeared in every culture. And Joseph Campbell actually discovered that every culture, even the ones with zero contact, tell the same essential stories. So, for example, the flood narrative that most people know from Noah shows up everywhere. The Mesopotamians wrote about surviving in a boat 1,000 years before Genesis even existed. The Greeks told it with Deucalion. Native Americans across the continents have flood myths. Aboriginal Australians, who, by the way, were isolated for 65,000 years, tell the same story. And it's just different names, different details, but always the same plot. Humanity gets wiped out, a few survive, and then everyone starts over. And so it's not just a coincidence. The way I see it is that consciousness leaves identical fingerprints everywhere that it evolves. And Carl Jung calls it the collective unconscious. So it's the shared mental architecture that all humans draw from. And certain symbols and story patterns show up everywhere because I believe they emerge from the deep structure of human awareness itself. And even if you look at it through a neuroscience lens, it's starting to prove Jung right. Our brains are literally wired for specific narrative patterns. Hence why that pattern of the hero's journey works so well to help you reframe something, to help any almost villain become a hero. And that's why I like to put ourselves through it first, because our relationship with ourselves is the most important. But our brains are wired for these specific narrative patterns. So even a 3-year-old can follow all the Disney movie plots because those plots follow the universal patterns that are actually encoded in so many of our sacred texts from thousands of years ago. So, for example, the hero leaves home, it faces monsters, and it returns transformed. That's really the basic structure. That's when I broke down those 7 steps. I'm like, if you're only looking at it through 3, these are them. Like, where were you first? what were your monsters? What was that return transformation? So someone divine experiences death and resurrection, or the innocent one makes a choice that changes everything. And so these are like templates that appear across cultures because they're consciousness technology embedded in human DNA and learned by us through story, felt by us through story. So the death and resurrection pattern shows up in Egypt, like Osiris, in Greece, which is Persephone, Christianity, which is Jesus, Buddhism is the Enlightenment cycles, because it maps the fundamental process of consciousness evolution. You can't access higher awareness while clinging to lower identity. That's the basis of it. And every breakthrough requires some sort of ego death and then conscious rebirth. And the fact that isolated cultures independently developed pretty identical narrative structures suggests that these patterns aren't just something we learn, they're almost hardwired instructions for how awareness evolves. And it's disguised as entertainment, but it's taking our brains and our consciousness through a transformation. So stories are not just how humans entertain themselves. They're how consciousness upgrades itself. And the evidence is everywhere once you know how to look. And when I started learning about the Eleusinian mystery schools and how they use story to create a transformation using psychedelics, it really solidified that we've known this for thousands of years. And it's been, I believe, purposefully stripped from us by those in control so that we don't understand how to use our own consciousness for that kind of transformation.
You just touched on so many things. So not only do I have like notes that I prepared for our podcast that I have that I was like, oh gosh, there's so many things. And then I had to get another book to pull out on some of these things. So have you heard of the concept by Rupert Sheldrake, who put out a very controversial TED Talk in 2013? It's called Morphic Resonance. And he's all about telepathy. So basically, he pushes back that memories are not stored. Like basically, science doesn't really know where memories are stored. Okay, and so there's a lot of issues for scientists are mostly materialist, and so they don't really believe in some of this like the agnostic. I'm sure you're tracking this. So we push back on the dogma of science a lot on this podcast, and so he suggests that animal and human learning may be transmitted by morphic resonance, which is kind of like what you would think about like the flower of life or some kind of conscious, even like how our brain, we don't even know consciousness. We can't scientifically decide on one definition of where consciousness resides, where it is within the body, where our thoughts are. Are they outside of our head? You're picking up on what I'm saying, right? So that's what morphic resonance is he scientifically can classify it a lot better. But he believes that this theory helps account for the ability of memories to survive, whether that's serious brain, like brain damage. He proposes he thinks like a butterfly can remember being a caterpillar or stuff like this in consciousness. And he's a very fascinating fella, Rupert Sheldrake, if you haven't heard of his work. But I think that y'all are just trying to put words to the same phenomenon, is that there is a blueprint that is in consciousness that all humans, he believes all species are connected to this. Kind of just like when you see the cell duplicating, you see the patterns of the flower of life. That's what I think they're tapping into morphic resonance of this shared memory pattern that we've had. I think it's a very fascinating concept. And so I love that you touched on just the resurrection, the savior figures, and how they were, whether it's mythic or Egyptian, but that hero's journey, it's just been dressed differently, but we see it in so many different cultures. It's similar for the Day of the Dead and the Torrid meteor shower and the evolution, I think, of Halloween, because I think these big resets or big destructions were so worldwide that flood narrative in particular is all over. And you mentioned in isolated tribes that had no context. So that really fascinated me. Randall Carlson has done some work on what he believes is like something that really rocked our consciousness so hard that that story of the flood and destruction and the Day of the Dead, we're remembering our ancestors that were lost in this great time, or Samhain, which just happened. And so that's what I've been tapping into is animism. I'm Celtic, very like 100% European. So trying to tap into maybe what my ancestors were doing prior to the takeover of Christianity, the forced conversions, and trying to tap into other myths that might not be so common. And then you still find these similar story narratives kind of in them. I just find that really fascinating. So is there something like you mentioned, and thank you for sharing so much of kind of your personal journey. My listeners know that I've gone through so many similar things, and college is definitely a really intense. I didn't have a lot of moral guideposts given to me as a child, so going into college was a real big free fall for me. I can't imagine, with having such a heavy heart and having so much intense stuff happen, right? I just gotten my wisdom teeth taken out. That's all I had right before I went to college, which wasn't that traumatic. Is there something you wanna share before we move into about your deconstruction journey that you touched on in college? You were already kinda questioning it, and then you realized that all these stories were repeating. Like, how did that leave you feeling? Because you mentioned it's been 20 years since you deconstructed. I'm very new into my deconstruction journey, as the listeners know. Can you share a little bit more about that? Because that in itself is like I mentioned earlier, we had solid ground of certainty, and now we're walking on water, loose ground. We're unstable. So what did that feel like for you?
Well, I want to touch on one thing you said about the morphic resonance, which I love because, again, it's one of those things that it's almost like the other concepts that we bring up where it's just talked about differently in different cultures. And the mystics have always called it the Akashic Records. It's the same thing. It's this energetic field that records every thought, action, and experience across time. In the West, Jung called it the collective unconscious. In quantum physics, it starts to sound like the field of potential where all information exists simultaneously. So they're describing the same truth in different languages. And every culture has had a name for this. Even the Egyptians spoke of the Hall of Records buried beneath the Sphinx. And indigenous traditions speak of dream time or ancestral memory. So I just love that. And whenever something aligns and overlays in such direct ways, that's when I'm like, that must be closer to truth, not the one that's trying to co-opt the truth and make everybody else wrong. And so I think I understood that on some level because for me, I was raised Christian and we were very involved in the church, like 5 days a week. I was volunteering at the younger programs. I was even in choir where we traveled along the West Coast singing at churches and homeless shelters and in leadership and just everything. And I had a lot of questions and the questions were not always welcome. For example, I remember specifically being in our True Love Weight seminar, which also happened every year. I had a ring about a ring declaring my abstinence. And we were talking about everything in the Christian version of sex ed. And I just had an actual question where I was like, well, I don't understand why abortion is wrong if they go directly to heaven and they skip this testing ground. Isn't that the most loving thing you can do for a child? There's zero chance they end up in hell now. And instead of answering a question that's valid for a 13-year-old, by the way, I was escorted out and made to feel wrong for spotting a hole in their ideology. Now, I have different feelings about that in general now, but that was a genuine question that I had. And so I was already falling away from it. The hammer came when my first sexual assault, I was unconscious and there was a crowd around me and it spread around school because there were people there and I didn't know how to defend myself. I actually identified, I thought that it was my fault because I was drinking. It wasn't until really the Me Too movement that I was able to see, wait, you were literally blacked out. That wasn't your fault. You were a victim there. And so, when I went back to church, my solos in choir were taken away because I was sexually active in a way that they did not like. And there was no questions asked. I just felt shunned for something that already felt very wrong in my body. And so I pulled away. I started going through these other traumas. I went to college where it was much more acceptable to question everything. And I felt really prideful kind of about like, oh, this is just wrong. Everyone's stupid over here. And then I went through a period of there's no God, but something about that felt wrong too. Like there's some sort of magic, there's some sort of matrix out there that connects everything. And I think I always felt pulled toward that. The problem is on my journey toward it, I didn't realize how much subconscious fear that I had because it was so deeply ingrained. And so I'm over here learning about tarot or trying meditation and then saying a secret prayer to Jesus just in case, because hey, I'm not trying to end up in hell. So if this is all real, please guide me back. I'm literally just trying to find the truth. So, and this went on for years. And so eventually I'm an introspective person. Like when I'm feeling something now, and I had learned enough by that point where I'm like, okay, well, how can I find the guidance to unravel this? Like, what is it that's holding me back? Clearly, it's fear. Now, where do I start? And that's one of those examples of me saying, like, I don't know how to get through this, but like, what do I need to know next? And I started reading different books. And one of those examples was I remember being at a coffee shop and I had just been researching and realizing like I think Jesus was misunderstood if Jesus existed. And but at least what the teaching about Jesus was saying is misunderstood. And I was following that thread. And then I'm at a coffee shop and I'm literally ordering my matcha and I hear somebody say the exact words. No, it's just fascinating because I learned that Jesus was just really misunderstood. And so I immediately pipe up. I'm like, what is this? And I turn and I'm just clearly eavesdropping. And he says, yeah, I've been reading these books by Bart D. Ehrman and they're just so fascinating. And I was like, all right, clear guidance. The next thing I need to do is read Bart D. Ehrman. And so I found his books. They have very clear titles like The Truth About Heaven and Hell, Jesus Interrupted, like the even Armageddon, what the book of Revelation really says. And I'm like, this is exactly what I need right now. And I started following that string. Now, one, I love Bart Ehrman, but his path is slightly different than mine. He wanted to deepen his connection with God, had always been a Christian, went to theology school, and theology school kind of showed him truths that unraveled his current beliefs. And so he's an atheist now. Atheism never really felt right to me. And so I had to take what I learned there while still following the path that I was being inspired to go down. So then I found Marcus Borg, who ended up being more of a Christian mystic and just following the threads. I don't align with really any of them. And I think that's where I'm at now, where I'm realizing that we're all on an individual journey. If I really believe that this existence is all of these individual threads of consciousness experiencing itself, then every single path is valid. This has softened some of my judgment and anger around people that have wronged me, around people that have very different beliefs that I don't understand, around people that are highly religious and judge everyone else for not being that, because that path is needed. It is an experience that is needed by consciousness. And so it's just taken me a lot of different ways, and even to the Gnostic Gospels, which has been really healing because they use a lot of the language of the Bible. They were written around the same time, only each one gives a slightly new spin on the very curated, crafted narrative that we were given by the Roman Empire in our current religions. And so even diving into those helped me see, okay, these people weren't so different than me. They're not trying to sell me an ideology. Somebody else in power did. What happens if I just open myself to the wisdom that apparently has been passed down for thousands of years? And that's still the journey that I'm on. So I'm constantly learning and coming up with new conclusions, what things mean to me in a different, and will shift just a little bit based on new information. But that's a path I'm always going to be on. I don't think we're meant to find absolute certainty. And when we feel like we're certain, are we really?
Yeah.
There is no certainty. The only certainty you can bring is maybe the trust that you have in yourself, that no matter what happens, I trust that I'm going to be able to tune into what I need at that moment and handle it. And so that's where I've kind of been shifting, is that certainty on external and bringing it more towards the internal.
Yeah. I appreciate everything you just said. And I laughed a little bit because I resonated so deeply with your secret prayers to Jesus part when you were saying that, because that was where I was at a certain phase of my deconstruction at night. Oh my gosh. I would still say, because I was like kind of Pentecostal and then I wanted to do it right. So I ended up being extremely Reformed Calvinist by the end of it, which is why I left, because like Calvinism, I think, is one of the worst things. Anyways, but yeah, I would say I forget what the prayer is now, but it's kind of like the Apostles' Creed. But yeah, I would sing and say prayers at night because I'd kind of like been ritually inhabited, like a ritual or a habit that I'd done, but also just these little prayers, like just in case you're still real. Or it's literally so funny when I think about season 2 or season 3 of my podcast. I'm such a different person each season. And it sounds like bibliotherapy was a big thing for you, and that's what it is for me. And have you heard of Pete Walker's work? Because he's it talks about complex PTSD. Pete Walker's books have been very impactful. I'm going to email you all the things I've mentioned just because it's been a lot. And he talks a lot about bibliotherapy and these books being kind of like your aunts and uncles on your journey of kind of like healing through trauma. Because sometimes your personal relationships might be rocky, or you might not feel like nervous system wise, you're really ready to adventure out that way. Like even to the point where you turned around and spoke up at that coffee shop took a lot of courage. Depending on where you are in your deconstruction space, it's very difficult to speak out loud about your beliefs in public to a stranger. So I think that's just really cool. And the thing I want to touch on about the Akashic records is there was this time where I was a short time where I was an atheist just because I was mad at all the religion, but I didn't really believe it either. Like you, I knew underlying, I've been an agnostic for so long. Christianity did me dirty. So then I was an atheist because I was angry. And that's where like Britt Hartley and Mind Shift from Brandon, some of these like kind of channels online were like rocking my world. But then I got out of that because of Rupert Sheldrake's work for sure, and the telepathy tapes. And have you dove into that? I'm sure. And so that was really fascinating. So that's kind of what gave me goosebumps. I was like crying listening to telepathy tapes because I needed that spiritual medicine because I didn't want to be stuck in the nihilism or like not believing in free will, which is what some of them, I was like, no, dog, I'm not picking up with me. Again, consciousness can have that experience over there, but that's not the one that's like resonating with me. So I really appreciate so many things of what you said about kind of coming out of that, or not, you didn't really subscribe to atheism, but you needed something more. And you kind of found that through chasing these threads. And Bart's work, yeah, it's fascinating because he's pretty mean. If you actually go as far to say that you don't believe Jesus, like the Jesus of the Gospels, I want to be very specific. Jesus of Nazareth, I believe, is a literary invention. And so he's pretty mean. He says you're basically a flat earther if you make that declaration. So I think Bart got a little gatekeeped when he was in theological school. And I don't appreciate when you so on our podcast, we have a little bit of beef. With him, only just because that was a kind of a nasty comment. He threw at all of us Jesus mythicists, which I think we have a pretty decent evidence backing for our statements. And I just think it's kind of nasty to say that. But his work, regardless of my beef, is monumental and pivotal for anyone who wants to kind of look a little more critically at the narrative that's been sold, especially from the Gospels, whether it was I've had some people who speak that they don't think it was the Roman Empire. They think it was a Jewish sect within the Roman Empire that came up with the Gospels to theologically conquer the Roman Empire, to make it collapse. So we never really know with history what exactly happened, but it's really fun to think and look at the primary source documents and just, again, not fall dogmatic. So in closing down, because we're almost at the end of our time, did you want to say anything before I move into the next? Because there's just so many things you say that I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to touch on. I just relate to all the things that come out of your mouth. It's amazing.
Well, one of the things that I've found very helpful, probably in the last 5 years, it's been my work, my inner work, is disidentifying with as much as possible. And I think at first, new labels were helpful to me. For example, I remember when I first learned about being an empath, I'm like, oh my gosh, so much makes sense. But then eventually it becomes a crutch. And it's like, well, no, of course I'm in turmoil right now. I'm an empath and I'm feeling all these feelings. And it's like the more I leaned into that, the worse it felt. And it's funny because I mentioned how I am currently very inspired by the Gnostic Gospels. One of them in particular, the Gospel of Thomas, because it's actually so aligned with so many canonical Gospels. But they'll say almost the exact thing with more added onto it. And it completely changes the meaning. It's kind of like, for example, we use jack of all trades, master of none. And it's almost like an insult, like now you're not mastering anything. But most people don't even realize the end of that is, but oftentimes better than master of one. And so like the original phrase is supposed to tell you to be a jack of all trades. Well, that's how so many of these Bible verses are, where all of a sudden the elongated one in Gospel of Thomas forces you out of literalism and makes you see it through symbolism. But one of the things that it says saying 42 is one of my favorites. It's very short. It just says be passersby. And what he's talking about is stop clinging to everything here, whether it's your beliefs, your labels, your identity. How can you just be a passerby in this existence? How can you witness what somebody else is doing and just go through it, become through that journey, but not hold on to, not have to bring it with you to show people like, this is who I am now, or this is what I believe now, or I align with this person over here, but just not right here. Like, just move through it and take what you need and leave what you don't. But I think that's so helpful because everyone's trying to sell you a label, usually because there's some other product behind that label that they also want to sell you. But if you can just experience and see what it's like to just let it move through you, which is a pretty fundamental practice of meditation. Here's the thought. You don't need to chase it. Just let it go by. But can you do that with every experience? It reminds me of the headless way, which is a really fascinating philosophy to study. But it's the concept is like, what if things aren't what you think it is? And so one example is a guy does a self-portrait, and most people's self-portrait is their torso. His is actually a picture of his view at that moment, the room, his feet up on an ottoman, the window. And if you really think about existence, that's what we really are. We're everything in the moment, but we're just keeping ourselves combined in this little body. And so you are everything that you're witnessing. Even Ram Dass's guru says, all the money in the world is mine. How do you have that when he only owns a blanket and he's living in the forest? Like, like, how do you have that concept? And it's just stop confining yourself to your limited identity and just let it go. That in general helps me get through things that are very difficult, whether it's an ideology, people, or experiences.
Yeah, I find that to be definitely counterintuitive, I think. So have you to for a lot of us when it comes to like not identifying with it. And we've mentioned I think before we push record or maybe on record, but I talk a lot about on my podcast the first from being the crunchy hippie to alt-right pipeline, which is again our labels, but I thought it was fascinating. And then when I deconstructed, I realized there was another pipeline and it was to the far left. And again, it seems like so many folks that were in the deconstruction, ex-Christian, or, you know, they're ex-Muslims, like just ex-religious, were still craving another identity. And that was just fascinating. So have you heard, and I talk about this podcast, I mean, this book, every episode, my listeners are probably rolling their eyes. The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Religion and Politics by Jonathan
I have heard of
Haidt.
it, but I have not read it.
Oh, girl, that book was, I'm going to reread it because it literally was the best book I read in 2024. And it just because I've been on the left, because I've been on the right, it helped me. He's a moral psychologist. He talks about how moral intuitions have evolved over time, and they're more like taste buds, how conservatives are and liberals have morals, but they just show up in so many different ways, like respecting institution versus, you know, not liking authority. Very fascinating kind of way he explained it. But the other thing is and how these moral intuitions are universal and they're across cultures. But the thing that I've thought was counterintuitive about not identifying with an identity that I think is like underlying difficult within our evolutionary psychology is the tribal identity. Because, you know, being xenophobic, like that's literally part of our ways. And even if shit hit the fan, like goes with like being with your like folks, and race is part of that. People want to negate some of those things, but I think that there's, and I don't know if that's wrong or right, and I just hit my mic because I'm talking with my hands so much. I just think that there's a lot of this tribal mentality that we've had back prior to when the systems, whether it was capitalism or the systems that we had back with king and queens and lords and farmers, whatever these systems were. I just find it very fascinating that and I'm not saying it's right that we're so driven by identity, and whether that's nationalism, it's just fascinating because I feel like there's some safety in that. And some of that safety, is that good? Is that bad? And always just being a passerby. I really did appreciate that because I don't want to be thrown into I don't want to be thrown into labels. And I've broken and shattered them all as I feel like you do too. As you pull threads, you don't really want to put yourself in a box. And I can really relate to all of that. But you see what I'm saying about like kind of that,
Yeah.
you know, that tribal mentality.
And that's the thing I had to learn the disidentification, and that message, that verse, that saying came to me at the point where I needed that wisdom. I kept finding myself. I always joke I'd be the first to join a cult and the first to leave. I love the feeling of identity. I've been wanting to find my people, my like-minded people. And then I go through it, and at first it feels amazing. And then all of a sudden I start to notice all these red flags. And then I feel like I dislike everybody and that everyone's dumb. So I went through that so often that I was like, what is this trying to show me? I went through my 7 steps. Like, where did I start? I wanted belonging. Everything in my past showed me that. My being an only child, going back and forth between divorced parents, being bullied, like so much of my algorithm taught me that I was alone. And so my deep need for belonging was very strong, which is why I was drawn to all of these things. And then I had to experience, like, hold on, am I just not finding the right one? Or is this my work? When I started to look at it as my sacred curriculum, I got a different meaning from it. And it's like, okay, do I need to reject everybody now because I don't align with certain parts of their journey that they're currently in that is resonant for them? No. But as you said, from an evolutionary perspective, disidentification is counterintuitive. Our nervous systems are wired for survival through belonging. The tribe kept us alive. So our instinct is to identify, to say that this is my group, my belief, my story, and that is ancient. And it's not wrong. It's just limited to the level of the ego. And so the ego's job is to protect itself, protect the self in general. The spirit's job is to remember the capital S self, the part that exists beyond the tribe, beyond form. And so the journey of awakening isn't about rejecting the ego. It's about acknowledging the ego's need and then evolving it, learning to use the ego as the interface for the world instead of an identity to defend, knowing that your ego self is going to want this thing. But if you want to fully awaken from the dream, you have the choice to lean somewhere else, to question that. You don't need to know how to disidentify. I'm still finding myself wanting to join groups and identify. But when I feel a certain trigger, I'm like, hold on. What would it look like if I softened into this? What would it look like if I was a passerby in this experience? How would that change me beyond me clinging to this version of myself? And so that's why being passerbys feels like such a paradox. Evolution gave us ego to survive, but consciousness gave us awareness to transcend it. So we start life as tribal beings needing to belong. And then as we awaken, the belonging expands from family to culture to humanity, and then to the whole field of consciousness. So the deeper the awakening, I think the larger the tribe actually becomes.
Yeah, that was awesome because I felt like I felt limited was the word I was looking for about this concept of tribal mentality. So I really do appreciate how you kind of built on that. Do you have time to finish up with the spiritual bypassing, or do you want to
Yeah.
close down? Okay, great. That'd be awesome because that's something that I experienced. I mean, even in the new age world, but like, oh, positive vibes only, or like I mentioned before we push record, and some of the most recent episodes I've done was the dark side of manifesting, because I mentioned there are physical limitations, like with my bodybuilding competitions. I couldn't, even with all my hard work and all my dedication and inch by inch life's ascent, doing all the right things didn't mean that my body's, there's still some limitations in this world, genetics or in environmental, but it doesn't mean that you can't pivot and strategize. There's this balance of reality and like having positive mindset and being goal oriented. I've thought a lot about Brendan Burchard's work. Have you heard of him and stuff? And some of the stuff you've been talking about the systems and how to be productive and your habits. And so I never want to like I'm a strong supporter of that as a personal trainer and mindset coach, obviously. And so spiritual bypassing is something that Christians are really good at. I think they're like professionals at it, and I'm sad for them and hurt by them. And so can we talk about, it gets thrown around a lot, and what does it actually mean, and how is it different than thinking positive or just rising above it when we talk about specifically spiritual bypassing? Like, what does that mean for the listeners? And then I'd like for you just to kind of talk about what this transcendent, I mean, we kind of unpacked it, but really just closing down the conversation with integration versus the bypassing.
Well, first of all, I want to give people grace if they realize that's what they've been doing. Just like I did when I attached myself to mind over matter, my heart was in the right place. I wanted to feel whole, and that's how I thought I was going to get there. And a lot of ideologies sell us that path. And I don't think it's always maliciously. I think quite often it's just misunderstanding or lack of education or lack of being far enough in the journey to actually understand it themselves. And so the idea is basically using spiritual ideas to avoid the human part of the journey. So we turned like high vibes only into a way of bypassing the work of actually feeling and integrating our pain, which makes sense because pain is scary. We don't actually want to feel it. And so I think when you start to actually tap into real awakening, you start to realize you can't skip the shadows. You have to metabolize them in a way. And manifestation got caught in the same trap. It's like we took the sacred principle that thought creates reality and then filtered it through the ego's desire for control. And then it became more about forcing outcomes instead of aligning with truth. So instead of actually co-creating our life, people started to try to out manifest their lessons in a way. And the universe doesn't really work like that. You can't skip the curriculum just because you don't know how to visualize it. And so that's what happened with me when I tried to skip the work, tried to skip the feeling. That pain still lived within my body. There's a really great book, The Body Keeps the Score, that shows the science behind that. It's not just a spiritual concept. And so if you don't allow a release of these emotions, then they're going to live within you and they're going to be controlling you in ways that you can't see because you won't acknowledge them. And so you don't always need to know how to do it. But I think at the simplest forms, it's about bringing those things to the surface and feeling it. And as much as possible, trying to detangle it from the story and the meaning that you've given it. For example, last year, I went through 2 miscarriages back to back. And it was very difficult, especially the second one, because it happened about 3 months in. I had already been dealing with the investment of the nausea. And it looked like I was 5 months pregnant because it was my third baby. And it was a very difficult loss for me. But I was grateful for it at the same time because I recognized that I was handling this much differently than I would have when I was younger. And I got to kind of be at that level of awareness. It reminds me of that viral TED Talk where the woman experiences her stroke as a neurologist. And so she's like witnessing it. And I was doing that where I was like, okay, I'm in this and oh my God, it hurts. But what do I know now? And where I was guided was, first of all, this all happened in a very strenuous time. Like 3 other traumas were happening. I was also hosting a retreat that week. And so I had to bypass it a little bit. I had to put it on the back burner, but then I made space to feel. I also brought awareness to the meaning that I was giving things. Like when I noticed the thoughts coming in about what this meant about my body or my womanhood or what I was capable of or about our growing family. And I was attaching these future predictions to what was happening right now when I didn't need to. That was making my pain deeper. So yes, I did spend a while in a pity party, allowing the stories to run rampant. My process, I kind of need that, but I have a time limit for it. And then I just start to feel, and it's like, where is this grief in my body without the meaning? Just shifting your attention to where it is, what it feels like, allowing yourself to sob, even turning in and saying like, okay, well, what do I need right now? Where is this? Like, what needs to come through? And just like letting the deep sob, the scream, whatever's needed to just move it through. Because that's what emotion is. It's energy in motion. And so you can help to stimulate this emotion. And then I would just rest in it. And just like in a meditation, allowing those thoughts that mean something about the moment to just pass by. And so that is how I see the integration part of it is quite often it's somatics of it all, but then also how are you alchemizing this? What are you going to do next? What choices are you going to make having had just experienced that? Are these the choices of the person that you want to become? Or is it a person of an old version of you that you want to evolve out of? And so if you just sort of follow that guidance, it's going to be a little bit different for everybody, but you can't skip the pain. You can't find a path that makes you not feel the hard things that you're going through, because that's when it gets stored in the body.
Yeah.
And also the good news is, though, that's when creation starts to become effortless, because you're not forcing it. You're actually just not resisting what is.
Mm. Yeah, that's really touches to kind of my point where I'm at in my own spiritual and just personal development is with my mom, and the mother wound that I have is she always tells me it's in the past, or pain makes her very uncomfortable. So she basically avoids it at all cost. And so we do not talk right now. And that's been really good for me to kind of put that relationship off. And because so much of what I carry now and so much of what I have to work through are from her and from that generation too. And when it comes to the body keeps the score, I've read that book. I think there's some limitations in that. I brought up Pete Walker. And I meant to say because he talks about the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD, and that's really fascinating when it comes to trying not only just integration, because once you understand, you mentioned somatics, which is the nervous system, which is understanding somatics is one layer. But why I didn't understand like the amygdala when it would get hijacked, and all of a sudden I would be sweaty palms, my heart was racing. That's when I would get my ideological rage, or have to unfollow someone because of what they said. Oh my gosh, where have you been all my life? When you said like you're the first one to join a cult and then the first one to leave one, I'm like, literally can't wait to go tell my husband. I'm like, I met someone that's like me, babe. I'm not of the friggin' book reading, thread chasing, changing your viewpoint every month. Like, I'm so happy to know that like there's other people on this journey besides me. I've literally felt all alone because I don't really relate to any tribe. There's a song like jokers to the left and clowns to the right, stuck in the middle with you. Whatever that song is, that's how I feel in life all the time, just stuck in the middle of not really aligning with these things. This conversation for me, you recently brought on a guest. Oh gosh, what was her name? When you were talking about, she really kicked off your meditation journey.
Oh, Ariel Garten.
Yeah. So I had a feeling that your interview would be my Ariel Garden for me, if that makes sense. Because she kicked off a whole journey for you. And I was like, damn, I think this woman is going to rock my socks and send me on a journey that I needed. My soul was craving you. So you were the direction, kind of like that rando at the coffee shop for you. You're that for me. So in closing, I just want to thank you so much for being here. I think your energy is infectious and I love your brain so much. I totally wish you're on the West Coast, right?
Yes.
Lame, because I'm not. I used to be. I love Portland, Oregon. My husband's from California. We love it over there, but we are now in Virginia and we have a house here. And I'm just trying to spiritual bypass myself and say that I'm happy here. But I really appreciated everything you said with compassion towards Christians. I was being a little snarky and you're like so much further on your journey. So I needed your grace there to provide to these people. I just really appreciate where you are in your consciousness journey, your spiritual journey, the kindness. Like you said last year, you were a little angry at Christians. So I know that comes in phases, but I just really appreciate what you're able to bring to the conversation that maybe I'm not because of where I am and my current conscious evolution. And I just really appreciate just how we mapped out healing consciousness in a way that was like honest, grounded, human. You shared so many of your own personal experiences that are deep. And that just shows your strength and ability to face pain, because I also throw out, like, I've been in sex work, I've had abortions, and people like they freeze up because and even when you mentioned earlier about when you got sent into college and you didn't know, you didn't have tools to handle it. I think a lot of society right now, it does not have the emotional intelligence to handle. I don't mean, again, finding grace and compassion for myself, for where you were. And hopefully this conversation really resonated with folks like it did for us. Is there anything you want to say in closing down?
Yeah, just a couple things to touch on. I mentioned how my anger for just ideological groups goes in waves, depending on my mood, my hormones, and my mindset. But recently I was still asking for that. Like, I want to soften judgment. I'm noticing it rise up again. And I had a man named Michael McAdams who also had deconstructed, but he talks about talking to angels. But he said something that really stuck with me. He said that religious people are actually further along than the average person because at least they're connecting or attempting to connect to the spirit world. And when I saw it through those eyes, it gave me a little more compassion, but also gratitude for them, because if no one around us was at all spiritual of any kind, this would be so much harder for us because we'd be the one forging the path in consciousness. And so, yes, they might be stuck in a prison, but it's at least 3 steps along the path than those who have nothing. And I looked at it the opposite way for a long time because I felt that what would have happened if I had actually been born to people who are looking at this in a new way. I met people in LA whose parents were already looking at things through the lens that I'm looking at it now. And I'm like, man, how much further along would I have been? And that combined with the idea of soul contracts. One of my favorite books is The Little Soul in the Sun. It's actually a children's book by the author of Conversations with God, Neil Donald Walsh. And I send it to people who are going through difficult relationships. I also have the mother wound, my most difficult relationship, and really my only difficult relationship at this point is my mom. And I won't say that this mindset shift healed everything, but when I need a way to soften it, the way I look at it as is, first of all, would I be so fervently seeking if I wasn't raised in Christianity, if I didn't go through that path, if I didn't see these things and felt like I came up against the wall and turned the other direction? Maybe not. So maybe she did lay down the first few bricks of my path. But also, those close relationships, if all relationships are mirrors, she's reflecting back to me every wound that I still need to heal. And there are periods of time where, yes, I need to just not be around that at all. And other periods of time where realizing that I'm not fully healed if I have to limit my environment because I'm not strong enough in the face of other people. And so, what if my mom is here to poke the wounds that need healing the most? What if all of this was exactly the circumstances that I needed in order to find what I'm finding now? That's how I believe that the universe works, that my life works, that this journey works. And so, yes, I go through ego moments of rejecting that and just wanting to make her wrong. But if I'm really looking at it from a higher perspective, everything is exactly as it's meant to be. And all I can focus on is what that's guiding me toward now.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because for me, I think I'm really stuck in the darker side of it. Like my mom told me, and this will probably make me cry, but she told me she wished she aborted me and left my dad. And the truth of that statement is in 2012, she was drunk. And that's the only time she's ever honest, anyways. But I felt everything in my life make sense at that moment because I knew though I was like, you never wanted to be my mom. Everything made sense about the emotional neglect, her lack of impatience. She said a lot of other mean things, obviously, if that's something can roll off her tongue. Really hurtful things that stick. And I'm sure she did other things. I don't want to negate all the things that my mother did for me because she will definitely remind you of all those things. But for me, I'm still really sad. I understand the soul contracts and that I'm just really confused still at why my soul chose. So that's what I mean by this conversation. Hopefully will help me because I don't like being here.
Well, the
It's
people that are on a path of rapid evolution have very
yeah.
few friends.
Well, this sucks because I think I have a lot of ideas. I read a lot of books and I want to talk to people about not Love is Blind, but this stuff, And so that's why I'm so happy to meet you. And also just I want to break free from how much hatred and anger and resentment that I carry for that woman. It is like a burning flame of and I know it's got to be alchematized, and that's what I mean by I don't want to bypass myself. You know, I want to stop talking because it sounds annoying with the tear voice, but I
I
just
cry on
figured
my podcast all the time. But I will say,
yeah,
any difficult situation is showing us what we need to find in ourselves. And so all of the things that you wish you could hear from your mother, those are the things that you need to learn to cultivate inside of
yeah,
yourself. And I went through a very similar thing. My dad actually told me that, your mom wanted to abort you. That was messaging I got when I was young because they were fighting, trying to be my dad didn't like that I liked my mom more. And then my mom told me when we got with my stepdad, God comes first, husbands come second, kids come last. And it was the final string of oh, I really am alone. It's not me and you against the world. You just traded up. And so I've also had these feelings, and my mom also says, "Why are you still holding on to that? It was in the past. I had a weak moment." Boomers don't know how to do this. They were taught something completely different. That's how they protect themselves. And so I feel ya. And I still lament about my lack of friends. I'm really good at making connections, but I used to have those like soul level friends where I was with them all the time. And I feel like maybe just at this phase in life, that's not how friendships work anymore.
Yeah.
And my mind isn't used to it. I still want that level of sisterhood. I don't have siblings. So I get it. And I wonder, what have I gained because of what I feel like I've lost? What has it driven me toward because I don't have this other thing to fall back on? And if I lean more towards those things and be curious about who I'm becoming and why and what purpose I was given here, what unique thread of consciousness that I'm supposed to follow, the other things just matter a little less.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm trying to focus on, because when I was in Portland, Oregon, I was performing. Yeah, I get what you're meaning about these connections. I was always at festivals. It's kind of like peak experiences. And I was one of the cool kids. I was always like on stage performing, and so I had access backstage. I got the free
Me
mate.
too.
So okay, so you can relate. So yeah, I guess I really
Nothing is a chemical bond quite like a bender with whatever copious amounts of drugs they're giving you.
yeah, I mean, I sobered up quite a bit because all the fancy costuming and like being able to perform, and like I was able to perform at Sonic Bloom with really big names. So I really didn't want to like with plastician and like really like if I dropped my hula hoop and it flung into their equipment, I would like literally lose it. So I definitely sobered up, and just the porter potties and costumes on drugs is traumatic. So I sobered up just for that. And so I really appreciate all that. I feel like I could talk to you all day, and I know that you have other things to do. So we'll close down the conversation, but just, I will link all the show note, like, your website, your podcast in the show notes. But if you'd like to just, share where other work or some of your courses, but I'll just link everything in the notes for folks who don't have to like jot anything down. But just what do you want to close down and share your work? And maybe if my listeners are really inspired to learn more from you, what could they do? Where can they go?
Yeah, you can find my all of my programs and podcast at mindlove.com. I also have a daily weekday email list called the Morning Mind Love, and it's just a positive note to wake up with. So to set your mind on a positive path every single day, a little bit of self-inquiry, a little bit of a mindset shift, completely free. That's right on the homepage of mindlove.com. And of course, Mind Love is a podcast you can find on any of your favorite players.
Okay, well, I'm going to sign up for that because I would like to start my day off with a message from you. And so thanks again, everybody, for listening. I really appreciate that you chose to share your time, which is one of the most precious commodities we have with us today. And as always, stay curious, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in.